And in astrology, we see that as well. Like the eighth house is our psychology. It's the underworld. It's where we struggle and where we find this willingness to suffer through the difficult experiences in life to find freedom. And it's one of the water houses, so it's emotional, and our psychology is certainly tied into our emotions. And so when Odysseus goes into the underworld in the Odyssey, he's going into his own eighth house. He's looking at his own demons. And when he goes there before he sees Tiresias and after, he's talking to these people he knew in life before they died. And so he's facing death. He's facing these demons. He sees his mother who killed herself out of grief for not seeing her son for over 10 years. I think he was gone from Ithaca for about 20 years. And so he sees his mother who committed suicide. He sees people and friends he had in his life who have died. And he's facing this shadow of life. And we all, to be really, truly free of our fears and insecurities and doubts, we have to face this shadow of life. We all have this latent fear of death, of our own death, of our parents' death, of our partner's death. We have latent fears of all kinds of things. And so simply to acknowledge that fear, simply to face it, gives us so much power. And a lot of difficult experiences come in our life, not because they in themselves can free us of it, because I think only we can free ourselves of it, but to wake us up to what's really inside of ourselves. So we go stay with our families. I came back to Montana where my family's from, and I spent a lot of time with my parents, and I see so much that I never understood by being around them a lot. I left home when I was 15 to go to boarding school, and then I didn't come back till I was 25. And in that time, I developed a lot of independence, and I developed a sort of spiritual momentum, and I began to meditate a lot. And that helped me see myself, but it wasn't until I felt that contact with my parents repetitively over years where I started seeing the root cause of my own psychology and my own fears, my own insecurities and doubts about myself, about the world, about everything. And I'm not free of it by any means, but I know I see it. Not everything, but I see a lot of it. And so I've accepted it, and I want to work on it. And it's going to be maybe a lifelong struggle, but the fact that I've been able to see that with my parents, with my family, that's so liberating. And so one of the real tragedies, I think, in Western society nowadays, especially in the U.S., less so in sort of Southern Europe where the family unit is still very strong, but in the U.S., kids leave home when they're 18. In my case, when I was 15. And because of that, we develop independence. We have a lot of willpower, intelligence. We have a lot of good masculine qualities, but the sort of emotional depth a lot of times is lacking, the psychological depth. And that depth is what lets us walk through the underworld unfazed, or at least unbroken. We will be phased, but not broken when we have that depth. And that depth is the willingness also and the capacity for psychological and emotional pain, which actually ends up healing us and purifying us. There's a quote by the Greek poet Aeschylus who said, "Wisdom is the child of pain." And in another translation it says, "Drip by drip, in place of sleep, memory of pain on the heart, against our will comes wisdom, the grace of God's by force." And in another book they say, the mercy of the gods is savage indeed. And that's because that suffering, that insomnia, when we go through life's difficulties and problems, it's to wake us up. And until we see that shadow of life, until we see the shadow of our own minds and psychology, we're not free. We're always going to be bound by these doubts and fears and these things that bring unhappiness into our life. And to cross to the other side, the only way to get there is through the underworld. And that's, I think, one of the places we're really missing it in our society, because we have these drugs that can numb us, that can supposedly remedy depression or anxiety or insomnia. But depression and anxiety and insomnia, since time immemorial, have been the tools of the universe to wake us up. We don't want to see these dark things in ourselves. We don't want to see the dark things in our family. And it's through this repetitive pain and suffering and despondency that we're slapped into awareness of something inside of ourselves that's been lurking, this monster that's just lurking inside of us and feeding on us, feeding on our energy, feeding on our confidence, feeding on our love, our ability to have joy. And so this ability, like Odysseus, to go into the underworld, to speak to the seers that we can even speak to inside of our own minds when we're suffering, it's liberating. And so these different experiences in life, difficult relationships, dynamics with the family, suffering, addictions, all these things, if we embrace that pain and we just own it, and we own that I'm addicted to this, or I'm depressed, or I'm anxious, or I'm so attached to my partner that if they left me, I think I would die. if we just own these things, for one thing, and we don't necessarily medicate them, maybe sometimes medication is appropriate, but I tend to think it's overdone in our society. You know, if we just kind of own that pain and we're with it and we feel it, and we're going to learn from that. Wisdom is the child of pain. And so this willingness to suffer is so great. That is this sort of like psychological hero to this willingness to go through these things. And in Greek tragedy, they celebrated that. And the Greeks were all about that. And so Homer was a Greek and Odysseus was a Greek. And all these heroes from Greek tragedy, like Oedipus, who I think is often misrepresented and misunderstood in our society because of Freud. But these heroes, it's like they wanted to see. When Oedipus is about to hear this awful thing about his mother, he goes, I have to know. I know it's going to destroy me. He knew in his heart it would destroy him. It would tear him to shreds. But he said, it's the truth, and I have to see the truth because the truth's going to set me free. And then he finds out that he unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. But it was like, it was so terrible, and it brought on such a depression in him, and probably insomnia. And I honestly don't even remember the end of the play, but what I remember is his willingness to know what was true, even though it was going to destroy him. And I think we have this idea that we're not supposed to suffer in life. We're not supposed to feel pain, but we are. We are supposed to feel pain. We all are supposed to suffer, not always, and we shouldn't be masochistic or sadistic about it. I mean, we should want to feel good and feel happy, but the pain is part of that process. It's part of the growing process. It's the spur to awakening, because we have this inertia in ourselves. I think it's part of the human condition. And that's sort of one of the Newtonian laws of physics. An object at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force. And so suffering is that outside force that gets us into gear, and we start questioning ourselves, and we start thinking about who we are and what we want to be. And when we come out the other side of that, we're more free, we're more at peace, we're more aware, we're more wise, we're more willing to open our hearts, we're more willing to do everything. We've become more of a spiritual hero in that process. And a lot of great literature is about that. I think it's a thread that goes through. It's a string that threads like all of these sort of, not all, but many of these gems of literature is like these heroes, they struggled with something great. Maybe in modern literature we celebrate sort of the mundane, but I'm not a fan of that. And so I want us as a generation and as a society to wake up to this. And we don't need to make all kinds of outer changes. We don't need to just totally do away with medications or whatever, but the attitude, I think, needs to change. The attitude about life, the attitude about loss and grief and sorrow. It's, that is everything. Everything is in that attitude. And just to embrace it and accept it as something that can be good for us, not something to hide from. And when we take it head on and we feel that pain and we're willing to grieve and feel loss and sorrow, we're going to become much bigger psychologically and spiritually.